Well, I'm a pastor, so like a lot of pastors throughout the week, I have to spend a lot of time prepping for my Sunday morning sermon. One of the things that I learned, I started pastoring about 7 years ago, that just I hadn't thought about before that is there's a Sunday every single week. Every week has a Sunday in it. And I had to learn that if I was going to deliver a message on Sunday that was impactful and accurate to the text, that people wouldn't walk out on and hopefully at least stay awake, that what I had lacked in experience, and I have no formal training, didn't go to Bible college, no seminary background. When I took the role as lead pastor at the church that I lead, I had taught about 3 or 4 messages at that point. So this was an area of terrific insecurity for me. And I've learned that one of the ways to combat a lack of experience or a lack of formal training is just prep, just work hard, really work at it. For me, that means I have to be very careful about what my time of research and content and rehearsal and all the things that go into making a good sermon. And I have to really lock out a lot of my life. And so in my weekly cadence, that's Thursdays. So on Thursdays of the day, that anybody in my life that knows me, they know, don't talk to Kevin on Thursdays. That's his sermon writing day. Well, this past Thursday, just a little over a week ago, was kind of a typical Thursday for me. I'd woken up, I'd gone through my morning routine, I had a sermon to prepare. We were at the end of a series. It was going to be kind of a traditional cost of discipleship message. I had already kind of pre-thought my application points. They all started with the same letter. So if you preach, you know that when they start with the same letter, the Spirit is really engaged. Occasionally, they'll spell a word. And if your first letter of every application point spells a spiritual word, then we're going to raise somebody from the dead that service. And so I thought I was feeling good about the message. So I do my morning prep. I sit down in my chair, and as is my practice, I try to empty myself as much as I can. I try to set aside yesterday's problems. I try to push off today's task list. I come before the Lord, and it's this combination of prayer and meditation. Every now and then a squirrel will run by the window, and so I'm working to not be distracted. And so I'm an hour and a half into this part of my daily preparation, and I'd left my cell phone sitting on the end table, and the screen lit up. And I noticed on the screen it was a name of a colleague of mine that I do business with. Along with being a pastor, I'm also a business person. I've coined myself a pastor-preneur. And in the businesses that I'm in, I started my first company in my early 30s. I bootstrapped a restaurant company, bought 4 restaurants, grew it to 8, operated them for a few years, and in the middle of that started a consulting company that I called the Boaz Company that is working alongside of restaurant companies, but has eventually morphed into a development company. So the work that I do now is about developing restaurant concepts. I currently have investments in 3 different concepts, 2 of which I'm the managing partner, which means I'm responsible for the day-to-day direction of what those companies do. And this colleague that had just messaged me is part of a concept that I'm part of. I own the territory in Cincinnati. He owns the territory in Columbus. We'd seen each other in Cleveland 2 days before. This concept is moving from a regional to a national level. And in that setting, he had asked me to send him a presentation. So when I saw his name, it would have normally been my practice to just turn the phone over and ignore it. But this, of course, guilt was coming on me because I'd remembered I hadn't sent him that email. So I quickly opened my computer, I forwarded him the email, I texted him quickly and said, "It's on the way," thinking that was it, time to get back to the sermon. He texts me back and says, "Hey, what'd you think of the meeting?" So at that point, I'm hooked because it wasn't a great meeting. I had some opinions about what was going on. And so for the next 45 minutes, he and I texted back and forth about the nuances of this national ad fund that had quadrupled our advertising spending. And we were concerned about the level of aided and unaided penetration, whether it was going to result in same-store sales, and would it eventually impact our EBIT on our bottom line. And then I remembered I'm supposed to be writing a sermon. So I quickly get out of that texting, and I'm again kind of getting before the Lord, trying to empty myself, setting aside that, and my wife walks in the room. And my wife and I lead a nonprofit together in the same community where I pastor a church. We've renovated an old elementary school into a community center. And what started out as a nonprofit focusing on just that community and the needs of that community, we've grown to now serve 4 school districts. And one of those school districts, it's actually the largest high school in the state of Ohio. Pretty affluent area, but the numbers are big for us. We have way overextended ourselves. We've committed with a lot more than what we actually have, and we were up against an issue within the bureaucracy of that school system about issues of confidentiality and how it is we were going to connect with the families that we were there to serve. And she came in to tell me that the superintendent had just broken a tie. And so we were relieved to find out that we were going to get this information that would allow us to do that program. And so we spent the next several minutes talking about what it meant for us and how that was going to affect our staff and our volunteers. And then she had this awakening. Oh my goodness, it's Thursday. I got to leave you alone. And so she left the room, and I went back to preparing the message. And I have to tell you that in the end, it was an okay message. It was all right. But I tell you about my Thursday morning because that's not unusual for me. That's actually a pretty typical day for me in the 3 worlds that I live in. And I share with that because what I want to offer you today is the perspective of someone who lives inside of that, not an expert in any of it, but someone who's made a lot of mistakes in that pathway. And I've had to learn how to operate because my native sector, what I'm most comfortable with, is I'm a business person. I love the world of business. If God said to me, Kevin, you can do any one of them, but you can only choose one, and I don't care, I would choose business. But that's not the life that I've chosen. That's not the life He's opened up for me. And so I have to be aware, and I have to work to understand that. And for those of us who work alongside of families that are struggling in poverty, we rely pretty heavily on the work of Ruby Payne. And Dr. Payne's work has literally given us a framework for understanding poverty. And the essence of that research is that there are class systems in America. There are hidden rules within those class systems. And for those of us who want to operate outside of our native class, to go into a foreign class and have a relationship, we have to spend some time understanding. We've got to understand their perspective, their reality, where they've been, what's impacting the whys of the decision. And so I want to share with you this morning that in a similar way, I think for those of us who find ourselves in those 3 sectors, the world of church, the world of nonprofit, and the business world, that I think we also have to think about what is different about the sectors that are foreign to us, because I think many of us have that native language, that native perspective. But I also know that the church needs the business community, needs the nonprofit, needs the church. And what I've experienced in my work in leading all 3 of these organizations, when those 3 things come together in a way that's focused on mission, led by humble leaders that are depending on the resources that God will eventually provide, it's a beautiful picture. But my pathway here has been a struggle because early on when I took on the role of nonprofit executive director, we were just learning about the principles of toxic charity and when helping hurts, and so there wasn't any real good model for us to mimic or copy. So I began to talk to other executive directors. I went to conferences and conventions, and I soaked in everything I could, and I noticed a trend that became very frustrating for me. That there was this phrase that everyone kept saying. They said, we just want to start a conversation. We just want to have a conversation. We just want to bring more people into the conversation. And I wrongfully diagnosed that as an unwillingness to move. That as a business person, as an activist, as someone who is built for change and movement, it was frustrating for me. But I can tell you now, several years of leading a nonprofit, conversations are critically important. That the awareness of what we are doing, the good we're looking to bring, if we move too quickly, that it's in fact we can do more harm than what we do good. And so I've had to learn as a business person to set aside my timeline, to actually invite people into conversations. I say that now all the time. We just want you to be involved in the conversation. Likewise, in working with pastors, we've grown this nonprofit to moving beyond just one community and one school building to now we're actually in 4 school districts. And what used to be the work of one church is now involving over 20 churches. What used to be 15 volunteers is now 350 volunteers. So we've outpaced our ability to do the massive amount of work that God has put in front of us. So we have to count on the church. I've got to talk to pastors. something I've not really been built for, not many that I really care for that much. And so as I begin to meet with pastors knowing that they have something that we need, but I've got something that they need, that I begin to have these conversations, and I realized that many times I would leave frustrated because my perception was they didn't care. My perception was they didn't have the passion about the topic that I was bringing. My perception was their theology was all wrong. And in many cases, I was right. But it was more than a trend, and what I had to come to terms with is something that I found out about myself, because sometimes I'm that pastor sitting across from someone who has a deep passion about something that I'm not able to act on. And what I have to remind myself, and what I want to remind many of you business leaders, is that as a pastor, I'm never in a position where I'm able to speak for myself. Every conversation I have as a pastor, I represent and I have the concerns of the congregation that I lead. As a pastor, I have to be accountable to the board of elders, of which I'm just one. And I'm speaking for them in many of these situations. And absolutely, as a pastor, and I consider what it is that God would have for our church in the season of where we're at, I have to filter every decision through where God is directing us and taking us. And so, no doubt, I have sent other nonprofit leaders away thinking that I wasn't concerned about their cause. I tell you all of that because really today I want to speak to the business leaders. I want to encourage you. George Barna tells us there are 20 million American Christians today that have disconnected from the church. They self-identify as Christian, but they're not involved in a local community. I believe, both from anecdotal evidence and what I see in research, is that many of those are business people that have disconnected because they can't find the meaningful work that brings them a connection. And so if that's you, I want to offer you a perspective of a business guy that's been in that same place, and I see the difficulty of interacting with the nonprofit, and I see the difficulty of interacting with the church world, and I just want to implore you to hang in, stay after it. But more than anything else, the lesson I've had to learn is that the number one currency that's traded in the economies of the church and the nonprofit world, this is my experience, is humility. And that often as a business owner, as a business person, as someone who has some level of success at something, I really want to come in and I want to change them. And the reality is that most of the time, God's looking to change me. And I look to the methods of Jesus where on the night before he's crucified, he's about to hand over. He's got a succession plan in place, and he's about to talk to his guys about what's happening next. He knows what's in front of them. And so any good business operator would have spent those final hours talking about the 5-year strategy, talking about the hierarchy of what was going to happen, talking about the public relations nightmare that was going to happen. But Jesus washed their feet. He spent time washing their feet, and I think that's a message for me today. I think that's a message for the way that I'm called to interact with those that I serve alongside. And more than anything else, what gets me moving in the morning when I think about the role that I have as a pastor comes from the teaching of the first pastor-preneur that we've ever known. That was the Apostle Peter. Peter had a fishing business, and he went on to become the rock that Jesus built the church on. Peter was the one that gave the first sermon when the Holy Spirit came in Acts 2, and he had to tell the onlookers, hey, we're not drunk. And he quotes the prophet Joel, and he quotes the Psalms and talking about David, and he delivers this beautiful sermon. He goes on to write a letter to the early church that was struggling, and in 1 Peter 2, he says to them, as he's focusing them on what it's going to look like to persist in this thing that we call the church, he said, you're a chosen people. You're a royal priesthood. You see, Peter was saying to the church at that time, and I think what Peter would say to us today, is that we are a priesthood of believers. And so before I get the option of checking out of that relationship for that pastor that I don't think is giving me the kind of time of day that I want, I have to remember that I'm a pastor too, even if I didn't carry the title. That we all have a cause to minister, and that it's the process of that ministry that does the most impactful and transformative work on me. Thank you.